Sometimes revolutions don't start with manifestos or rallies. They start with a sign on a burger joint in a small provincial town. In the summer of 2021, the entire shift at a Burger King in Nebraska walked out in the middle of the workday. They left a message on the marquee sign out front. "We all quit. Sorry for the inconvenience." A photo hit the internet. A couple of thousand likes, a dozen articles in local news. It seemed like a local conflict. Bad management. Nothing special. But over the next 6 months, the incredible happened. 4 million Americans did the exact same thing every single month. They quit en masse and all at once. Not because they had found something better beforehand. They were just walking away into the void. From restaurants, shops, offices, and warehouses. A mass exodus like this had never been seen before. They called them the generation that doesn't want to work. Lazy, entitled, unprepared for reality. The problem is, the numbers say otherwise. They work just as much or even more than their parents did at the same age. Yet the purchasing power of their labor is drastically lower. They are the most educated generation in history, but the first in decades destined to be poorer than their parents. Maybe it's not about the people. Maybe the deal that worked for decades is broken. Hard work no longer guarantees a house, a family, and stability. And Gen Z was the first to say it out loud. Over the last 5 years, they have staged the quietest revolution in the history of capitalism. They simply refused to play by the old rules. And surprisingly, in many cases, they turned out to be right. So what happened? Why did work stop being the path upward? Who is to blame for the fact that young people no longer believe in what their parents believed? And most importantly, what happens to the economy when an entire generation stops believing? First off, who exactly are these Zoomers? Generation Z includes those born roughly between 1997 and 2012. Right now, they are between 14 and 29 years old. This is the first generation to grow up with smartphones in their hands, the first to not remember a world without the internet, and the first to be shaped in an era of one crisis after another. But to understand why they quit en masse in 2021, we need to go back to 2008, to the moment when, still children, they first watched their parents lose jobs and start worrying about money. 2008 was the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression. While economists on TV explained what happened to mortgage-backed securities, kids were watching something else. Their parents losing their livelihoods. 1 in 5 young people under 25 couldn't find a place in the workforce. Families moved into smaller apartments. Some lost their homes, and dinner table conversations turned into anxious whispers about bills and loans. For Gen Z, this wasn't an abstract economic term from a textbook. It was the moment they realized you can do everything right and still lose simply because the system broke. Their parents worked, paid their bills, and in a single moment, the rules changed without warning. And then it turned out it wasn't just a bad year. Studies showed those graduating from university at the height of the crisis earned 17.5% less than graduates in prosperous years. And that gap persisted for the next 15 years of their careers. You were simply born at the wrong time, and that decided your fate. Not your abilities or your effort, just bad luck. So, many did what seemed logical, went to study further, wait out the crisis in grad school, get another degree, enter the job market when things got better. It sounded like a reasonable plan, except for one detail. While they were studying, the world outside kept changing. And when they emerged with their diplomas, it turned out the game had changed even more than they thought. By the mid-2010s, the economy had formally recovered. Unemployment fell to 50-year lows. The media spoke of a boom, and companies reported record profits. On paper, everything looked perfect. But for those aged 20 to 25, the numbers told a completely different story. Here is some simple math. In 1980, the average price of a home in America was roughly 3 annual salaries. Not the highest salaries, just fairly average ones. By the early 2020s, that ratio had grown to 7 salaries. Meaning, to buy the same house your father had to save for 3 years to afford, you need 7 years. And that's assuming you managed to save anything at all. Rent rose even faster. In the early 2000s, the average American spent about 20% of their income on housing. By 2022, that figure crossed 30%. In major cities, over 40%. Imagine, almost half of what you earn goes just to have a place to sleep. On top of that, you need to eat and clothe yourself. But here is the most cynical part. Salaries barely moved. Formally, they grew, but adjusted for inflation, a 22-year-old worker in 2020 earned about the same as their peer in the 90s. Meanwhile, the economy grew, productivity skyrocketed by 64%, and companies got richer. The money just flowed in a different direction. And this isn't just an American story. According to a meta-study by Human Relations Journal, which analyzed over 100 papers on Gen Z, only 6% of Russian Zoomers want to occupy leadership positions. The same figures apply in America, Europe, and Asia. A generation raised in different systems, different cultures, with different histories is arriving at the same conclusion about work. A career no longer guarantees a better life. So a young person finishes university, gets a job for $35,000 a year, pays $400 a month on loans, rents a room for $1,500, and thinks, am I doing something wrong? Actually, no. They are doing everything right. The rules of the game just changed, and everyone forgot to tell them. By the late 2010s, Gen Z already understood work is no longer a path to a house, a family, and stability. It's just a way to pay bills until next month. The American dream turned into American rent. And then, something no one expected happened. The pandemic arrived and flipped everything upside down. The spring of 2020 erased the last illusions. In a matter of weeks, millions of jobs vanished. Cafes, restaurants, shops, hotels, everything where a significant portion of young people worked simply closed. In April, unemployment among Gen Z spiked to 27%. That is higher than during the 2008 crisis, higher than any other age group. Those graduating in the spring of 2020 walked out into nothingness. Job offers were rescinded a day before the start date. Internships were canceled. Graduation ceremonies took place on Zoom, and immediately after, the panic set in. What now? The older generation said, wait it out, it'll get better. But Gen Z already knew what waiting out a crisis meant. They saw it in 2008. They knew scars last for years. But something unexpected happened. Those who managed to keep their jobs suddenly found themselves at home. Offices closed, meetings moved to video calls. Work continued, projects were submitted, deadlines were met, and clients got results. That's when it turned out that sitting in an office for 8 hours and spending 2 hours commuting isn't necessary to do your job well. It was a moment of clarity, not for companies, for people. They suddenly saw what life could look like when you don't have to pretend to be busy just for show. When you can finish a task at 2 p.m. and go for a walk instead of feigning activity until 6 p.m. When a lunch break is actually a break, not eating a sandwich over a keyboard. Simultaneously with the arrival of the pandemic, a wave of anxiety washed over everyone. Isolation, uncertainty, constant news of deaths. Psychologists recorded record levels of stress and depression among young people. Every second member of Gen Z said their mental health had deteriorated. They worked from their bedrooms, studied in front of screens, stayed home for months, and for the first time, they felt it so acutely. Life is short, and they were spending it on work that burns them out for a salary they can't live on. By the end of 2020, something finally snapped. Not the economy, but a psychological barrier. That very fear of what if I don't find anything better, which kept people in places where they were miserable. The pandemic showed that the worst can happen at any moment, regardless of your loyalty to the company. So why stay where you're unhappy? And when the world began to open up again in 2021, something happened that no one foresaw. People didn't go back to work. They left in droves. Historians will call this the Great Resignation. 4 million Americans quit every month throughout the second half of 2021, a record since tracking began. Signs appeared in the windows of cafes and restaurants. Closed, can't find staff. Business owners complained in interviews that no one wants to work, that young people are spoiled by handouts and are all sitting on couches at home. On the internet, this turned into a meme. Photos of signs saying nobody wants to work anymore, with sarcastic comments. Maybe it's because you pay $8 an hour. But people did want to work, just not for that money and not in those conditions. The pandemic hollowed out the service sector, and when everything opened up, employers expected the same people to return to the same positions for the same pay. They didn't return. The barista took a job at an Amazon warehouse, getting $6 an hour more. The waitress found a remote job in a call center with a stable schedule. The retail clerk became a courier, where you can listen to podcasts all day and not talk to people. And that's when companies panicked. For the first time in decades, workers had leverage and started using it. Fast food chains raised wages by 10 to 15% in a year. Retail introduced signing bonuses. And warehouse giants started advertising tuition reimbursement and health insurance. And Gen Z felt it for the first time. Their labor is worth something, not abstractly, but concretely, in real money. If one employer doesn't value it, another will. The average Gen Z worker by the end of 2021 stayed in one place for just over a year. Not because they couldn't sit still, but because changing jobs once a year turned out to be the only way to get a real raise. The older generation just shook their heads and kept saying, no stability, hopping around like fleas, but the numbers said otherwise. Those who changed jobs every year or two earned 50% more over 4 years than those who remained loyal to one company. The system itself taught them not to be loyal, because loyalty was no longer rewarded. It seemed the balance of power had finally leveled out. Young workers dictated terms, wages rose, companies made concessions. But then two things happened. The economy started to slow down, and a phrase appeared on the internet that blew everything up. In August 2022, engineer Zaid Khan posted a 20-second video on TikTok. He calmly explained, you're not quitting your job, you're quitting the idea of going above and beyond. You're still performing your duties, but you're no longer subscribing to the hustle culture mentality that work has to be your life. In 2 weeks, the hashtag #QuietQuitting racked up 300 million views. Millions of people made their own videos explaining they do exactly what they are paid for, and no more. They don't stay past 6, don't answer emails on weekends, don't take on extra projects without extra pay, they aren't sabotaging work, they are simply setting boundaries. Corporate America reacted as if an epidemic had broken out. CEOs released statements. Experts spoke of a crisis in work ethic. Media headlines screamed that young people had forgotten how to work. But if you strip away the emotions and look at the numbers, the picture was different. Gallup conducted a study and found employee engagement was at 32%. This meant that about half of workers were doing the minimum and weren't burning with enthusiasm. Sounds scary? Maybe. Except that figure was the same in 2010 and in 2000 and in the 90s. Meaning, quiet quitting as a phenomenon has always existed. It just used to be called phoning it in or wasn't named at all. The difference was one thing. Gen Z made it public, gave it a name, and stopped being ashamed of it. Moreover, they asked an uncomfortable question. Why is this bad? If the contract says 40 hours a week, why does the employer expect 50? If the task is done by 3 p.m., why sit in the office until 6, pretending to be busy? Old logic said, do more. You'll prove yourself, get promoted, get rewarded. New logic said, do more. They'll dump more tasks on you without extra pay because you can handle it. Burn out quietly until you break. Which of these scenarios did Gen Z see in reality? Exactly, the second one. By the end of 2022, the term quiet quitting became synonymous with something bigger. Not laziness, but a rejection of the idea that work must be the center of the universe and everything else is optional. That personal life, health, hobbies are things to be sacrificed for a career. And maybe, someday, it will pay off. Spoiler, for the majority, it didn't pay off. And Gen Z saw this. They saw parents who gave 30 years to a company only to be fired a year before retirement. Saw older colleagues with heart attacks at 40 and divorces due to chronic absence from home. They saw that loyalty to a company is a one-way street. So quiet quitting wasn't a rebellion. It was self-defense. And when company executives started calling it a generational problem, they answered, the problem isn't us. The problem is that you exploited loyalty for decades, and now you're surprised it's gone. The war between generations turned from a hidden conflict into an open confrontation. And then began what can only be called a public flogging. One by one, influential people, CEOs of major companies, and media personalities took to the podiums to explain what was wrong with the youth. 70-year-old Whole Foods founder John Mackey said bluntly in a podcast, young people just don't want to work, especially, he says, in liberal cities. Everyone wants meaningful work immediately, but, as he believes, meaning must be earned. Actress Whoopi Goldberg on The View added her take. If you want to work 4 hours a day, don't be surprised that buying a house is going to be hard. And Professor Scott Galloway, speaking at a Wall Street Journal conference, put it even more harshly. The more time you spend at home, the less chance of success you have. Want to be in the top 10%? Prepare for 20 years where there is almost nothing but work. Every such statement went viral, but not in the way the speakers expected, because for every criticism, thousands of replies poured in comments, videos, articles, and almost all of them boiled down to one thing. Okay, boomer, tell us how you bought a house on one salary at 25. Later, a video went viral. A 27-year-old guy screams into the camera with genuine desperation, most old people don't know what it's like to work 40+ hours a week and still not be able to buy a home. 16 million views. Thousands of comments like, finally, someone said it. And that's where the real rift was exposed. Not in work ethic, but in reality. Those criticizing the youth lived in a world where effort directly converted into results. Worked hard, got a raise, saved for a few years, bought a house, built a career in one company, earned a pension. For them, this was the law. But Gen Z lives in a different world, where you can work 60 hours a week and still share an apartment with 3 roommates, where changing jobs yields a bigger salary increase than years of loyalty, where pension plans are something from history books, and health insurance is tied to the employer so tightly that getting fired can mean financial catastrophe if you get sick. The conflict wasn't about values. It was about one generation giving advice based on the rules of a game that no longer exists. It's like someone teaching you how to win at chess, but you're playing poker and they keep saying, well, just move the rook correctly. The absurdity peaked in the spring of 2021 when a group of junior analysts at Goldman Sachs, 22-year-old graduates from top universities, created a presentation about their working conditions. 98 hours of work a week, 5 hours of sleep. A quote from the document. This is inhumane. They sent it to management. Someone leaked it to the media. Scandal. The reaction was predictable. Half the internet. Spoiled kids, welcome to investment banking. The other half, finally someone said out loud that this isn't normal. Goldman promised to hire more people, limit hours, and introduce weekends off. Did they keep their word? That's an open question. But the very fact that junior analysts staged a public revolt, that was unthinkable just 5 years ago. The war was fought on all fronts. Every CEO's criticism of the youth was met with a barrage of data. You say we're lazy? Here's the productivity chart. It's up 64%. Here's the wage chart. It's up 17%. Explain the math. Every work harder tip crashed against reality. I work 2 jobs and still live with my parents at 30. And somewhere in the middle of this media circus, the point was lost. The real problem wasn't whether Zoomers are lazy or Boomers are harsh. The problem was that the economic system that worked for half a century stopped keeping its promise. And instead of discussing that, everyone argued about TikTok and work ethic. But while heads were talking, hands were doing something else. Young people didn't just complain online, they acted. And their actions turned out to be far more powerful than words. Because while some argued over terms, others were organizing, and they did it in ways the union movement hadn't seen in the last 50 years. December 2021, Buffalo, New York. Starbucks employees vote to form a union. 19 for, 8 against. This is the first Starbucks coffee shop to unionize in the company's history. The average age of voters was 23. Half of them had never encountered unions before in their lives. They just decided enough working for minimum wage without a stable schedule. Starbucks reacted harshly. They closed stores ostensibly for renovations and fired activists under various pretexts. A classic suppression script that worked for decades. But it didn't work, because in the 21st century, 20-year-olds have the internet. Every firing of an activist turned into a viral video. Every attempt at pressure became a reason for a new rally, which immediately went live on stream. And by the end of 2023, unions had appeared in more than 300 coffee shops across the country. Same story at Amazon warehouses. In the spring of 2022, in Staten Island, a warehouse with 8,000 employees voted to create the first Amazon union in America. The movement's leader was 33-year-old Chris Smalls, whom the company fired a year earlier for organizing a protest. After the victory, he spoke into a megaphone. For the young generation, this is a message. We We have power. Don't let companies tell you that you are just a replaceable number. And here's what's important. These weren't hardened activists with years of experience. These were 20-year-olds for whom the word solidarity transformed from history textbooks into a real tool. They grew up on movements like Black Lives Matter, in a culture where speaking about injustice is normal. For them, organizing a union is a continuation of the fight for rights, just in the workplace. The numbers are impressive. In 2022, the number of union petitions grew by 53%. This is the biggest jump in half a century. Polls show 74% of Americans approve of unions, a high since the 60s. But the most interesting part is the age breakdown. Among Gen Z, support for unions reaches 80%. Among young men, 65%, which is higher than any other group. Why? Because it works. Young workers in unionized jobs earn on average 17.5% more. They have more stable schedules, better conditions, and a higher chance of getting paid sick leave. This isn't abstract solidarity, it's concrete money and concrete days off. The wave hit not only low-wage sectors. Apple Store, Google, Microsoft, the New York Times, white-collar workers who for decades considered themselves above labor problems suddenly discovered they had the same issues. Instability, overwork, lack of influence on decisions, and all this worked precisely because unions were considered a relic. Gen Z wasn't tied to old structures. They built new forms of organization: horizontal, fast, digital. A strike wasn't planned at a committee meeting, but in a Telegram chat 2 days prior. Solidarity wasn't gathered via leaflets, but via viral videos. By 2024, it became obvious. This isn't a blip. It's a trend. The generation accused of laziness and individualism turned out to be the most collectivist in the last half-century. Their collectivism just didn't look like what people expected. No parades with red flags, TikTok, petitions, public shaming of companies via social media. New tools for an idea as old as the world. Together we are stronger. But while some took power through unions, others went a different way. If the system doesn't change itself, you can simply stop being part of it. So what actually happened? Why is the generation accused of laziness simultaneously creating unions, changing corporate culture, and forcing companies to rewrite 50-year-old rules? The answer is simple and uncomfortable. They aren't lazy, they are rational. They grew up watching the old deal stop working, saw parents lose jobs in a crisis, saw older siblings with degrees that guaranteed nothing, saw that company loyalty is a game played into one goal, and they made a logical conclusion. If the rules of the game have changed, we need to play differently. Quiet quitting isn't a refusal to work. It's a refusal to sacrifice life for a job that sacrifices nothing for you. The Great Resignation isn't mass laziness. It's a mass realization that changing places every year is more profitable than sitting in one. Unions aren't a return to the past. They are an admission that you can't win against the system alone. And here's the interesting part. In many cases, it works. Companies that introduced a 4-day week didn't lose productivity. On the contrary, they reduced turnover by 57%. Firms that offered remote work received 800% more job applications. Places where unions appeared raised wages for competitors too, because otherwise people leave. The system started changing not because someone at the top decided to be kinder, but because Gen Z refused to play by the old rules and showed there is an alternative. They didn't wait for permission. They just did it. Of course, not everything is so rosy. The economy is slowing, the labor market is cooling, and worker leverage is weakening. Many of those who spoke loudly about boundaries in 2021 are quietly clinging to their jobs here in 2026 because layoffs continue to come in waves. But something has changed irrevocably. Taboos are broken. Talking about salary out loud is normal. Refusing overtime is normal. Quitting if it sucks is normal. Discussing mental health at work is normal. What was considered unprofessional 5 years ago is today the standard for an entire generation. The question isn't whether Gen Z is right or not. The question is that they were the first to admit the fact out loud. Work no longer guarantees a better life. And when an entire generation understands this simultaneously and starts to act, it's not the generation that changes, it's the world around them. How about you? Have you ever quit because you simply couldn't take it anymore? Or the opposite, stayed in place even though you wanted to leave? Write in the comments. It's interesting to know how much this story resonates with your experience. Thanks for watching to the end. See you in the next episodes.